song comes from the tradition of the African American tradition, and it's often a song of lament, pain, and struggle. But I have a slightly different view of that song from an experience raising my daughter. She was like 2 or 3 years old. She had just been potty trained, a major achievement for the family. So she was in the bathroom, and Natalie was with her, and she wanted to go into potty by herself. So she sat in the toilet, and her little legs couldn't reach the floor, and Natalie was looking through the crack in the door just to make sure she was okay. And then she was trying to reach the toilet paper, and her own hands couldn't quite reach it, and she knocked it over, and it fell on the floor. And she was sitting there, and she went, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." So problems are relative. So Natalie and I can't really hear that song without thinking of that story of this little 2, 3-year-old with her legs not reaching it, not able to reach the toilet paper, not able to reach the floor. But we are people of stories. You know, stories of difficulty, like not having toilet paper available when you need it. And we like stories with a sense of drama, with uncertainty. And we become engaged with the protagonist. The story of the hero's journey is well known. It's the archetype that's really important. And the person is a classic template for stories, be it from Lords of the Rings to Star Wars to Finding Nemo. This is cultural story. I think I'm going to move off this mic. It's getting a lot of breath. I'm going to use the handheld. Is that better? I don't know why I was catching so much breath today. I think someone was playing with my mic last week. It was bent all out of shape this morning during rehearsal. But yeah, the hero's journey is this classic story, this template of a person goes on an adventure, usually away from home, refuses some call to serve because of doubt in themselves, meets a mentor, has a variety of challenges through which they confront enemies and also make allies, has a victory in a major crisis, and returns home transformed. It's a classic story. And we always credit the Greeks with that, but it probably precedes them by a long way. It's just the Greeks probably wrote it down. But they said that Hollywood, every story in Hollywood is just a retelling of a Greek story. But our stories make us the experience of who we are. And much of our friendships and relationships are based on our shared stories. And I remember having a really profound moment when I was actually cleaning out my mum and dad's house, and I found a picture of my dad when he was a toddler, maybe 1 year old. He was sitting up. He might not even have been able to walk. Then right next to it was another picture, and it was the last time I was with him when he was alive. And it was a whole family, my brother, his wife, Natalie, myself, Isla, and my mum and dad. He was 76 years old. He'd been struggling with ill health for 20 years. And I looked at the picture of the toddler, and I looked at the picture of my dad, this 76-year-old man suffering various forms of ill health. And I thought, what connects these two people? What connects these two people? And I realized it's the stories. Like stories of his experiences, the events in his life. And some of which we don't know. He is the only person that knows his own stories. We are the only people that know our own stories. We may know part of people's stories, but we do not know their whole story. And we tell stories. We tell stories about ourselves to people. But we're usually quite selective about the stories we tell. We probably don't tell the really difficult ones. Perhaps we don't tell the ones we're ashamed of. Perhaps we don't tell these stories because we're not sure of the response we're going to get, because it might just be too deep, emotional for others to hear. So how do we select the stories we tell? Well, Jean-Luc Godard, the French film director, said that every story should have a beginning, middle, and end, but not necessarily in that order. And I kind of experienced this through the experience with my mother. As most of you know, my mother struggled with Alzheimer's for 7 years. And she forgot her own story. She forgot her own story. And you realize how so much of our personality, so much of our relationship is the shared stories we have. But then I also recognize that within myself, what story do I tell about my mother? I tell all sorts of stories about my dad, but so much of the stories I tell about my mother, who died at 87, I talk about the last 7 years of her life and her struggle with Alzheimer's. But my mother was so much more than that. And even to the end, even through the struggles of Alzheimer's, where she lost so much of her dignity, in my view, and so much of her self-respect, she was still kind, sweet and warm as she always was. She was not the same person I knew, and I would often say that early on. That is not my mother anymore. And I realized that was unfair, that was dismissing her, that was the story I told myself to cope with her illness. I'm not sure it was the truth, it was still my mother. So what stories do I tell about my mother now? Why don't I talk about her sweetness, her kindness, how she nurtured my brother and I to be the people we are? That's the story I should be telling, but I'm not telling because, as I've mentioned to you before, I don't think I've ever mourned my mum because it was such a relief when she died because of her Alzheimer's. And I think we see the stories we select to tell. I mean, social media is a prime example. You know, we often look at social media and we see everyone's highlight reels and we look at our own life. I mean, it's like a bad rehearsal behind the scenes. It's not the highlight reel. You know, people going about their fabulous trip to Bali. And I'm waiting for a late train to get to work. And I love my work, but it's not like a trip to Bali. But how, as we asked in the prayer, how do we listen to stories? Do we listen to reply, to give advice, to share our story, to understand the person telling the story? Is that what we listen to? We do not know most of the stories of everyone in this room, even the people we know really well, maybe even our intimate partner. We do not know all their stories. We only get glimpses into the story as much as people are willing to open us to. And sometimes we worry about someone else's story is so much harder than ours, and we get into this trauma Olympics. My story is not nearly as bad as other people's, therefore I shouldn't own it. But your experiences, your hardship, your trauma is your trauma. It's not the trauma Olympics. And there's another model that we get trained as chaplains, you know, in Blythe, and how her work gets trained. It's called the ring theory, about you care in and you dump out. The person most impacted by something deserves care. It's not for them to take care of you. You find someone further removed from the situation. You dump out to them and you provide care in. It's a ring theory, so it's always care in, dump out. And we in the pastoral care team work on that as well. So think about, when we listen to someone, what do you want to provide to them? Do you really want to acknowledge and hold in your heart, hold their story as a center of a meditation? Because that's honoring their story, that is showing the affection to them. That is the act of love and listening.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Let me tell you the story of my mother, Nancy Bosley. Waiting for her picture to get up on the screen. There she is. She was a Midwestern girl who loved to laugh and loved life. After her career path went in an unpredictable way, she became a flight attendant. She met and married a lovely man, and they had a daughter. They divorced, and she struggled a bit in the next few years. She worked as a salesperson for a mattress company, which she really enjoyed. Over the span of many years, she realized that she had a problem with alcohol, and in 1988, she got sober. She then embarked on a path of recovery, self-improvement, and helping herself and others become better people. She was a sponsor and a huge support of many people in Alcoholics Anonymous. She married another lovely man. She discovered a path to faith in the Church of Religious Science and deepened her spiritual journey even more. Her daughter had a couple of kids, and she absolutely was over the moon with being a grandmother. And then at age 63, she died. How did she die? You might have some preconceived notions about how she died. You might think that maybe she died from a fatal disease like cancer, or you might think that she died in a fatal car accident or something like that. But it's much more tragic and shocking than that. Nancy was murdered helping her friend escape a domestic violence situation. And let's get through the tough stuff first so you know what the context is. Nancy's friend Patty had gotten a restraining order on her abusive ex-boyfriend, and my mom had gone to court to help her with that process. My mom had stayed at her house overnight after they had gone to court. In the morning, Patty's ex-boyfriend showed up at her home with his unregistered gun. He took my mother's life, and he wounded Patty, her daughter, and her daughter's boyfriend. After doing the damage that he did, he ended up taking his own life as well. There's a lot of shock here, so I'm going to go light a candle for Nancy while we kind of process. So let's talk about what this brings up. You see, the thing is that what you're experiencing right now, the bewilderment, the shock, the thoughts, the feelings, the questions, this is what I have shied away from in recent years. I have made choices to be mostly quiet about this material in recent years because sometimes it's just too hard to deal with. There have been many times when I have delivered this information to someone and I have ended up taking care of the person I am telling instead of them taking care of me. Because it's just so difficult to digest. And while I understand why this happens, sometimes it's just easier to avoid the whole thing. Also, if you find it hard to believe that something like this could happen to someone like me, why is that? Is it that the gravity of such an incident is incomprehensible? Or is it that things like this only happen to people who look or behave a certain way? I encourage you to examine your preconceptions of what you might have around this. And the reason I say this is because I myself had many preconceived notions before this happened to my family. I certainly never thought anything like this could ever have happened to me or the people I loved. I realize that I present in a certain way that belies the sadness and heaviness that I have experienced. Most people would describe me as happy, upbeat, kind. And yes, some of that has to do with my innate nature, but much of it has to do with the work I have done on myself. For the better part of 25 years, I have been in therapy. I am very lucky and privileged that I have been able to access that kind of care, and I am not inflating or exaggerating when I say that therapy has saved my life many times over. The other main source of my strength has been that I feel the presence of my mother with me all the time, even now, especially now. In the last few days, when I looked back and realized how much I have resisted talking about this subject matter, I became very sad. When my mom died in 2008, all of us who were left in her wake vowed to keep her memory, and specifically her sacrifice, alive. We promised each other over and over again that we would keep telling this story because we felt she died a hero, and we wanted to make it known to the whole world what she did for her friend. We wanted to shout it from the rooftops. We would talk about her on social media, and we would tag our posts with, "Say her name, Nancy Bosley." We were loud and we were proud. But very slowly, over the years, a sense of normalcy and calm began to take place of the extreme pain. My family, my friends, and I slowly oozed back into our quiet, mostly uneventful, even-keel, middle-class, privileged lives. We began to see how disruptive and upsetting it can be to talk about what happened, and how we were lucky enough to not have to deal with that level of disruption and upset in our daily lives. And for the most part, in many situations, we ended up choosing the softer, easier path. I feel ashamed now, because I feel I have done Nancy and her sacrifice a disservice by not talking about her. When I signed up to begin serving as a worship associate at this church, I think I had it in the back of my mind that I wanted to talk about her, about this. I wanted to push myself out of my comfort zone that I had built around myself, my zone of silence. I knew it was time to embody her courage and make her sacrifice known to people who never had the pleasure of knowing her. Nancy deserves to be talked about. She and her friend Patty deserve to be talked about. And Patty's daughter Shasta, and Shasta's boyfriend Philip. All three of these people were wounded that day, and they survived. They have physical and emotional scars that will last their whole entire lives. The truth is, when confronted with a person wielding a lethal weapon, my mother Nancy stepped in front of and shielded her friend with her own body. How many of us would do the same? How many of us could do that if we were in that situation? My story is that my mom is a hero. My story is that I am the daughter of someone who gave the ultimate sacrifice. My story is that I have resisted sharing my story because sometimes it feels like too much. But really, when I choose that path, I choose to negate and silence Nancy's sacrifice. If I think it's painful to talk about her death, well, that pain is nothing compared to the pain she endured and that she endured in carrying out her last decision that she ever made. She gave everything she had and everything she would ever have. So I will say her name, Nancy Bosley. Thank you.
I too would like to say a name, Nancy Bosley. Thank you, Blythe. That was so much courage for you to share it. Not only the story of your mother, but your own hesitancy and struggle with saying it, talking about her. So thank you. It was a gift. Maya Angelou says, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." There's no greater agony and bearing an untold story inside of you. Sorry? Please. Nancy Bosley. We do not know the stories of everyone in this room. We heard one of the most difficult, tragic, and in many ways inspiring stories of what Nancy did for her friend. And most of us know Blythe as the person you described, kind, joyous, in the helping professions. I see where you get your courage from. But we make assumptions about everyone we meet, those people online that are irritating us, those people that cut us off in traffic, those people that go on and on in a meeting that we just want to end. We don't know their stories. And I've said before, we make assumptions. And the only thing you can tell by looking at someone is your own prejudices. The only thing you can tell by looking at someone is your own prejudices. And the way we really get to know folks is listening to the difficult stories, as we all just did, including those of you online, listening to Blythe's stories. We all know much more, but not everything about you. And that's true for all of us. And I hope that we can take away from this is each of our stories deserve to be told. And it's not the Trauma Olympics, and may not be as drastic or as heart-wrenching as Blythe's story, but it is your trauma, it is your experience, and it's part of who you are. And what we can offer for people as we listen to them is that affection, is that love, and that care and support. Not contributing our story to their story, but offering them care and support. Care in, dump out. As a community, we hold each other's hearts in the palm of our hands. And we need to be gentle caregivers of that responsibility. We are on this epic journey of life together, never fully knowing each other, but holding each other in love through all life has to offer.